on this episode of the WildFed podcast.
Imagine going back in time, pre-contact here in North America. You're living outside literally 365 days a year. It doesn't matter what the weather's like. Imagine the skill set and the relationship and knowledge of the land you would have to be able to live in that kind of way.
Nature doesn't want to take anything away from you. Nature wants to nourish and feed you, but the technology wants to take something from you, and it doesn't give a lot back.
When we go out into nature, we can see truth. We can see simplicity.
Once you actually start to learn some of those skills, you realize, oh, this is something that everybody does have innately in them.
You know, you can have all the skills in the world, but if you don't have the connection, the knowledge, those skills and that equipment can fall apart really quickly.
Watching how other animals can't see tracks is very fascinating. You start to understand there's something really special about human cognition.
Our families and our future generations need us to actually be aware, alert people to navigate some of the challenging times ahead.
Episode 58 of the WildFed podcast, Come to Your Senses. Cultivating Awareness with Chris Gilmour is brought to you by Surthrival. As we head into winter, be sure to fortify your immune system with proven supplements that work. Supplements like vitamin D3, K2, bovine colostrum, medicinal mushrooms like chaga and reishi, and much, much more. Check out the entire lineup of premium immune support at surthrival.com. This episode is also brought to you by Wild Food Warehouse. Wild Food Warehouse carries premium wild rice harvested by Canoe in Minnesota. I remember the first time I tried real, uncultivated wild rice. Before then, I used to buy what's sold as wild rice in supermarkets thinking it was the real thing, and I liked it, sort of. It never really seemed to cook all the way through, though, so I was left thinking wild rice was kind of rubbery and tough to chew. What I didn't know was that this wasn't really wild rice at all, but rather a paddy-grown agricultural product. Once I tried the real thing, which cooks soft like brown rice, but with a richer, nuttier, almost smoky flavor, I realized I'd have to harvest it myself or purchase it from folks like Wild Food Warehouse. If you're a regular listener, you already understand the value of truly wild foods. With winter on the way, now's a great time to stock your pantry with real food. Wild Food Warehouse sells ethically harvested wild rice collected by hand, parched over a wood fire, and delivered directly to your door. It makes a great meal on its own, and it pairs perfectly with your other hunted, fished, or foraged ingredients. Price breaks start at £5, and the coupon code WildFed gets you 10% off your order. Remember, this is a truly wild product, so supplies are limited. Go to wildfoodwarehouse.com to secure your supply. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. Today we're talking with Chris Gilmour, wild food enthusiast, survival skills instructor, tracker, emergency preparedness consultant, homesteader, and all-around wilderness skills practitioner. Chris takes us on a deep dive into the concept of awareness and how we can start to increase it in our wilderness experiences and in our day-to-day lives. While a state of refined, high-quality environmental and self-awareness was once crucial to even our most basic survival, we modern humans have somehow created a world that not only greatly blunts our awareness of our immediate surroundings, but even rewards a state of near total distraction. We become lost in the fog of the mind, run amok in a dopamine-induced feedback loop, losing touch with our senses as if they were vestigial organs, left to atrophy in the old world as we step bravely into the new, virtual one we're creating. But for those of us who are seeking meaningful connection with the earth and the community of life through practices like sustainable wild food harvest, cultivating awareness is possibly our most crucial starting point, and it begins with coming to our senses. Unfortunately, when someone begins a wild food journey, and in particular when they start hunting or fishing as an adult, this isn't often a skill that they find promoted by corporate interests that represent modern outdoor recreation. You simply can't package, brand, or sell awareness. You can't upgrade it each season, print it with new camouflage patterns, or make it scent-free for total concealment. Instead, it's built through diligent, self-directed practice, time utilized asking the right questions, and painstakingly analyzing the information we receive from our incredible sensory systems. It's not the fast and easy path. That's the path you can buy in the box stores. But it's the rewarding one, the one that never runs out of batteries, gets lost in the field, or becomes obsolete when next year's model is released. It's the path that leads to becoming part of nature instead of just a visitor. Chris Gilmour, welcome to the show.
Hey, bud, glad to be here.
Hey, man, tell us a little bit about all of the interesting things you are a part of, because you got a pretty cool gig going on over there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, sometimes I tell people I'm a professional juggler, but in my mind, it's all connected. So I guess you could kind of break it down into three main areas. So naturalist skills, ecology, survival, that's a big part of what I do. So I teach, things like wilderness, survival skills. I teach people how to track and read the natural landscape. I teach people about ecology. I do that on a college level, and I also do that on privately. And I have this cool online course that I do it through as well called Nature's Forgotten Language. And then my wife and I are also wild foragers and actually run a wild foraging business where we sustainably and ethically go and harvest things from the land and turn them into products. Anyone wants to check that out, you can check out wildmuskoka.com. And then the third hat I wear is in emergency and disaster preparedness. And really, what I see that as is, helping people prepare for the many, many changes that we're seeing in the world today. And I really kind of use my experience in the outdoors and nature as a core component of the approach that I take with emergency preparedness. So I work with businesses, individuals, and again, I have a course for people in that called Survive the Storms. So those are kind of the three main hats I wear. And I come from a background of outdoor education and wilderness guiding. I was a guide for about 8 years.
What kind of guiding were you doing?
I did a little bit of everything. Canoe guiding was probably the main thing I did. I used to lead flying canoe trips in the backcountry way up in northern Ontario. I was a dog sled guide for a number of while. I've done hiking trips.
Oh, no kidding. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, dog sledding, ton of fun. And then I've also led a lot of actual survival expeditions, where we go into the woods with next to nothing as an actual training experience and help the students kind of go through an experience like that and all the amazing life lessons that come out of it.
It occurs to me that it gives you, all these things you've described give you this really, really well-rounded portfolio because, you have sort of the ability to thrive in the wilderness. You have the ability to survive in the wilderness. Those are kind of like two different but interrelated things. And then I think like if we're in the built environment, typically we are thriving. But then in the disaster type scenario, now you have the survival skills for the built environment too, right? So if I'm understanding it, you've sort of looked at how do you go from, taking care of your core needs and up to really making sure you're thriving in both of the outdoor and the built environments?
You're very much right. And, that was actually a conscious decision of myself going back, say, about 10 years ago. I'd spend, 10 years training pretty heavily in wilderness survival, ecology, tracking, all those kinds of things. And really at that point in life, I kind of just wanted to disappear and live in the woods. But I started kind of just thinking about, the reality of modern civilization and what does it look like to now take all these things I've been learning in the woods and apply them to our modern ecosystem and our modern lives. And that was actually kind of the start of my journey into emergency and disaster preparedness. And I'd also, practice survival on, an individual basis or survival in groups, lost in the woods, and started thinking about, well, what does it look like to take survival and apply it to a city now, or apply it to a business, apply it to the modern context again. So it's been kind of fun weaving those all together.
I really have a passion for all things survival, be they wilderness, be they urban. I like, well, I think, and it's part of the generation, I'm from Generation X. It's the rugged individual survivalist generation generally. Speaking,
I'm a Gen Xer too, so I could relate there a bit.
Yeah, well, it's funny, right? Because now as we watch millennials come up, it's really easy for us to sort of judge their softness, but we forget that boomers and Gen Xers who had millennial children wanted to parent them really well because we were so unparented in Gen X. And so there's this sort of, we've engendered a kind of softness and communalism in them that as survivalists, we're sometimes like, hey guys, you need to pay more attention. But I mean, they're kind of blessed in that way. But here we are, this sort of rugged, Gen X folks, and we have this survival mentality. But I just wanted to say that when I go into the more urban side of it or the so-called prepper side of it or any of that kind of stuff, I often feel like there's something missing there. And when I get around the primitive skills folks or the foragers or people who, are into the woods or on the sea,
I find something there that's more fulfilling to me. And I always wonder about how to interrelate those. So I'm kind of curious for you, how you said that you have been applying a lot of what you learned in the wilderness environment to that disaster preparedness in the built environment. I'm wondering if you can contrast those two mentalities and sort of talk about how you've married the two together.
Sure. Yeah, I would love to. And I wonder if this is what you're thinking about when you talk about that missing piece, kind of in that modern survival prepper kind of movement. And I very much saw it when I actually have done a bunch of work in kind of like modern big picture emergency disaster management, working with governments, working with businesses, doing like wide scale mock disasters and that kind of stuff. And I actually very much felt like something was missing there, which is why I kind of broke out and started my own consulting firm around that, trying to take a bit more of a holistic approach. And for me, one of the big missing pieces was this idea of awareness and relationship with the land. And to me, that's first and foremost. And the way that I was mentored in survival, awareness kind of is like comes before all else. You can have all the skills in the world, but if you don't have the connection, the knowledge, and even the relationship with the land, relationship with yourself and the land, those skills and that equipment can fall apart really quickly. And, maybe even to back up a little bit here, and I think it's kind of relevant to share how I came to that myself, because I was brought up in the outdoors. And, I was into fishing and canoeing and, as a Boy Scout and all those things. And relative to most of the people around me, I was the outdoors person. So it kind of went to my head. I thought I knew a lot. And in my early 20s, I took off. I always had this dream, to go live in the mountains like Jeremiah Johnson, grow a big beard and live off the land. And so I actually, when I was in my 20s, I made a go at it. I literally went off to go live by myself in this cabin up in the mountains. And I was so incredibly humbled while I was out there and really felt like a fool going out there with all what I thought I had a lot of skills, a lot of knowledge. And I basically realized like my whole life I've been hanging out in the outdoors, but I've been moving like a tourist when I'm in the outdoors. I'm kind of separated. I bring all my gear and sure, I know the names of a couple of things and maybe I can identify a tree and know what that track is. But it's like very, very surface level. And it got me thinking, imagine going back in time pre-contact here in North America. And you're living outside literally 365 days a year. It doesn't matter what the weather's like. You're outside all the time. There's no grocery stores. There's no pharmacies. There's no clothing. There's no steel. There's no cotton. Imagine the skill set and the relationship and knowledge of the land you would have to be able to live in that kind of way. And it basically opened me up to this idea that like, oh my goodness, there's this entire language that exists in nature and all of this information that's actually essential to being human and to being a really resilient person and to really being our best selves in the world that's coming at us all the time. And in a short period of human history, we've actually, I think most people don't even realize it's there anymore. And I was 20 years old and had no idea all of this stuff was actually happening around me. So it kind of set me off on this long journey, and some of my early mentors, I just remember like things like, they'd hear a sound off in the distance and they'd be like, oh, someone's coming up the trail. And I'd be like, what? And I don't mean the sound of a person walking. I mean, like literally they'd be listening to the birds and be like, oh, the birds told me that a person's coming. Or, hey, I think there's a predator moving around there. Maybe it's a moose that's like in rut, or maybe there's a bear. And we go over and sure enough, there's tracks there, So the birds are telling them of things moving or telling them that the weather's about to change, So there's this incredible depth of knowledge that we can take from the natural world that's so relevant to being efficient humans. And I've become really obsessed with like kind of bringing that in. And then when I got into the world of emergency and disaster management, kind of from a modern perspective, we have all these amazing tactics and, we can train awesome first responders. We've got all this fancy gear and radios and all of this stuff. But if you, at the end of the day, cities are built inside of ecosystems. Nature is still like the fundamental principle of all life, and the rules of nature apply in everything. And so often in our modern world, and even in our modern emergency response, if we don't factor in nature, nature is just going to kick our ass in the end, And if we learn to actually observe nature, learn how it works, learn all those subtle little details, then we can start to work with nature to design way more efficient and better systems to begin with, So in my emergency management, one of the approaches that I take, maybe I'll give two really quick examples there and then I'll pass it back to you. But one example of how I would bridge those two worlds is teaching awareness through like, we don't need an app to know that the weather's going to change tomorrow. All of nature is telling us about what the weather's going to do. Nature can tell us about predators in the landscape. Nature can just give us all this stuff that increases our situational awareness. And as a responder in any kind of situation, that helps me to be a kind of ahead of the curve and more likely to be ready for whatever's around the next corner. So that helps me from a response perspective, and that's really, really valuable. And then the other one is from a design perspective. I can look at models in nature that are really, really well built to begin with, and then I can start to think about like, well, how do we apply them to the design of our systems? So, maybe it's looking at, every time there's a major power outage in the biggest city near me, which is Toronto, I want to say 90% of the time, it's the same species of tree whose branches are cracking and falling on the power lines and causing that. There's a certain species of tree that just doesn't hold up well to ice. It's Manitoba maple, and they're planted everywhere in the urban ecosystem. So when I think about like emergency planning, the people that are designing those systems and even the responders, they're not thinking about like, well, why don't we plant a species other than Manitoba maple around our hydro lines? And then we'd actually have less power outages, So once we start to understand ecology, we can actually design in a smarter way and use nature as a way to actually buffer and mitigate against disasters and emergencies, if that makes sense.
It does. You can really imagine the disconnect between the folks planting those trees and the people tending to the power lines. And these systems are so big now and so cumbersome. And, it's sort of like you start off with a really simple atom like, hydrogen, and you just have this electron swirling a proton. And then you can put two together, and now, you've got helium, and you keep stacking them and stacking them. But once you get to a certain number of those all packed together, you get unstable systems, right? And that's radioactive isotopes. They start breaking apart. And it's sort of like you look at our urban infrastructure, there's just so many moving parts. And I kind of want to go back to this thing you were talking about a minute ago. It makes me think about you were talking about all the incredible equipment and all the things, the tactics that exist, the strategies that exist in emergency management. It makes me think of our medical systems in a way, because it's like, I've always said, if I'm in a car accident and I have a terrible trauma to my body, I want cutting edge hospital care. I want Western medicine. I want all those machines. I want all that stuff they have to put me back together. I don't want my herbalist to come in and administer tinctures and poultices. We have better stuff now. But for chronic care, like if I need to recover long-term or take care of my health long-term, I don't really want Western medicine. I don't feel like they really know how to do that, And so that's when I want the herbalist, or that's where I want, the alternative care.
And part of that's because our body is indeed an ecosystem, and it's part of an ecosystem, right? And that's the approach that the herbalist takes. And when you bring these two skill sets together, the best of the modern world and the best of the ancient world, it's really powerful, the skill set that we're left with there, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, it seems like one of those sides is not so as invested in coexisting, unfortunately. But yeah, that's kind of the point I'm making, is like, what you were saying before about looking at natural systems to develop your strategies and plans, because ultimately we're a natural system. And obviously, like you said, our built environment is built on and around and inside of ecosystems. So I find all that really, really fascinating. I want to go back, though, to some of these things you were talking about, because it almost sounds like magic to people. And when you start to say that your mentors are able to pick out things, it's almost like, to the outsider, like they have a sixth sense. But obviously, as you begin to learn these things, you start to understand, no, you're just using your five senses, right? And I think also it's really easy for people to accept. For instance, if we started to tell stories about, let's say, ethnographic reports of Europeans who are working with Native American trackers, and they can't understand how they have this information, it seems like magic. But, once you actually start to learn some of those skills, you realize like, oh, this is something that everybody does have innately in them. Obviously it's easier if you've grown up in a world surrounded by, nature and understanding the language of nature. But as I understand it, when it comes to tracking, when it comes to the language of the animals around you, this is stuff that can be taught, correct? So I just want to clear that up for people, that this isn't really necessarily metaphysical. These are like learned behaviors, correct?
Yeah, it very much is a science when you break it all down. And, you put that into context. I gave that example going back 365 days a year. Suddenly there's massive consequences to making mistakes. And when I'm in a place where there's massive consequences, it just pushes me to have a new level of awareness and notice things that I might not have noticed if I wasn't in that state. And I feel like the world's, gotten very comfortable the last couple of years, which has allowed us to just kind of turn off these certain aspects of awareness. And it's happened long enough now that when we hear these stories, it does sound magical. But definitely, we can break these down into very scientific things. And, I could give a quick little story here just to give an example of that. So I'm out with a group last year. We're doing a survival day, like a survival skills day. And it's about 11 o'clock in the morning. And I'm noticing that the bird activity is very, very loud and very, very frantic. There's a lot of companion calls, meaning the birds are kind of chipping single notes back and forth to each other. They're moving around a lot, kind of frenzied feeding. And, to say where the science is, so the moral of the story, or where I'm going, is the birds were telling us that about a storm was about to come through, even though there was no wind and the sky was beautiful and sunny. So anyways, I pulled the group in and I'm like, hey, you guys noticing the birds right now, like how frantic they are and how much noise is going on? And they're like, oh, no, we weren't really noticing. I'm like, okay, well, just pay attention to the birds for the next little bit. So a bit of time goes by and, everyone's going about their things. Suddenly the forest is totally quiet. You can't hear a bird sound anywhere. And it's still beautiful and sunny. There's no wind. So I pull the group back in again. I'm like, hey, what are the birds doing? And oh yeah, we forgot. We weren't paying attention. Well, just tune in for a second. And wow, there's no birds was the observation that came back. I'm like, okay, sweet. Go back to doing what you're doing. About 20 minutes later, we literally watched this red pine tree almost bend over sideways. And suddenly there's this massive wind. There's these dark clouds. There's thunder. There's lightning coming in. And, for me, I could have just said to the group in that moment, hey, there's going to be a storm in an hour from now. It's probably going to be a real big one. And they'd look around and see it sunny and clear. And then when it actually happened, they'd be like, oh my goodness, Chris is like a magician. Like, how did he do that? He has some crazy powers. But really, it's just scientific observation with my senses. So I know how the birds usually act at different times of the day throughout the season. Usually there's a lot of activity right at dawn. We call it the morning chorus. And then things kind of mellow out by like mid-morning. So 10, 11 o'clock, things are going about their day, they're feeding, but it's not this intense burst of energy. So I just noticed an intense burst of energy when things should have been a little bit mellower. And I used that. And I also noticed this stillness and that the wind had actually been blowing out of the north a couple of days before that. And there was this real stillness right now and this odd little blast of warm air coming out of the south. So I picked up on those two things and thought, oh, okay, this is telling me that a storm's coming. It's a very logical scientific thing, but if people just saw snapshots of it, they'd be like, oh my goodness, Chris knows how to predict the weather. He's got like magic powers. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's that saying, I think it's something to the effect of, in the world of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, And it's kind of like, you could almost imagine if you grew up you were literate and everyone around you was illiterate and you were moving through, let's say, an urban environment like we have today where there are signs everywhere and people they don't know what they mean. So they just have tuned it out, but you can read. It would be like it'd be like what you're describing. To you, it's the simple science of reading, but to everyone else, it would seem like, how does he know where everything is? How come he always knows where the exit is? How come he always knows, whatever it is. So it's like, similarly, you're just reading these signs and it gives you information. But I'm thinking, when I was a kid, the world felt very noisy to me. And I spent a lot of years learning to tune things out. I would try not to be influenced. Let's say I'm in a checkout line and there's all the tabloids there. I'd be like, can I avoid even looking at these? Here's all this information, but I don't want to see it. Or, the way the television is, or commercials, for instance, trying not to be influenced by all that stuff. And then as the world became busier and busier, you start tuning things out. And if you're in a really built up urban environment, you learn to tune out sirens. You learn to tune out car alarms. You see some people learn to tune out assaults that happen, right where they are. And just, you see people like trying to not even notice. Right. So I feel like a lot of people have, out as a sort of survival mechanism, have actually dulled their senses on purpose. You following me? And so let's start like with that kind of as the lowest common denominator, because so many people are like, the idea of coming to your senses, I love that phrase. People say that. If you think about what it really means, like come to your senses, it's like, hey, you're not using your senses to perceive your environment. But a lot of us have done that as like a coping skill or a survival mechanism. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that, because a lot of people are starting from It's almost like if you have like level 10 is you know what the birds are saying, and 0 is like sort of average. A lot of people are below 0, not because they're not capable of it, but because as a way of keeping themselves, trying to reduce external influences, they've dulled or tuned their senses out.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting angle you bring up on the why, and I feel like you're very on track there. And it's those two things, you know. There's this dulling on purpose because of the overstimulus, and maybe even just these parts of the modern world that we just don't want to see. You know, the example of the tabloids there. And then with that comes, I think, also just this, like, I almost want to call it like the great forgetting that as life got more comfortable, and as I say comfortable, I don't necessarily mean life's not hard, but I mean, you know, we've got sidewalks, we've got cars, you know, so as we started to kind of remove the need to be to be aware, you know, there's not the consequence of getting eaten by a cougar anymore or the consequence of getting eaten by a bear, then our awareness gets pulled from those things, and it doesn't take more than a generation before we forget that that's even there to begin with, you know? And at the end of the day, this is all about brain patterning, right? I always give this example when I'm teaching tracking skills. Tracking is one of my favorite things to teach, and I think it's phenomenal how it transforms us as individuals, as humans, and impacts every part of our life. But this is kind of funny. I was going back a number of years ago. For whatever reason, I never really tuned in on the idea of our Kia cars. And my wife and I are driving, and I'm looking at this car in front of us. I'm like, "Whoa, what's that? What the heck is a Kia?" And she's like, "You got to be kidding me! You don't know what a Kia is?" And I was like, "No, I have no idea." And she's like, "It's a car brand. They're everywhere." And once I saw that Kia, it was everywhere I looked. And then I was like, you know, a real annoying pain in the butt, because every time I saw a Kia distributor, I was just like, "Oh man, they're sure expanding fast, aren't they?" But at the end of the day, you know, I just didn't notice Kia until someone pointed it out or I noticed it, and then they were everywhere. And the same thing kind of goes with nature. So for both of those two reasons we discussed, humans just aren't patterned on nature the way that our ancestors once would or were, and thus stuff's right in front of us and we don't even see it anymore. And it's amazing, you know, you can spend a lot of time in the outdoors. Like, as I said, I was an outdoors kid. I was a Boy Scout. I did canoe guiding trips. You know, I spent a lot of time outside, and I still miss 99.9% of what was right in front of me when I was in the outdoors, because I didn't have people mentoring me and opening up those brain patterns that showed me that this was all possible.
Luckily, this stuff is innate and deeply embedded in our psychology, right? So I want to kind of say that first, that we're talking about something human beings have done as long as there's been humans, whether that's, you know, so far we've been talking about sort of visual sense, and we've been talking about our auditory sense as applied to our environment. This is ancient stuff. So it's not quite like starting from scratch, because you have a lot of, for lack of a better term, I know it's in a scientific term, but you have, like, you know, genetic memory, lineal memory of this way of seeing the world. And then I would assume that a lot of how we're operating today in our day-to-day life as civilized humans, a lot of the neuro pathways we're using are probably things that were originally intended for some of this stuff. So it's not like these parts of our brain are totally dormant. They're just being used to, you know, recognize logos and brands and, you know, things like that increase our social status. And then the other thing I want to say is that, you know, most of us, we didn't grow. A lot of people did not grow up, especially for millennials, did not grow up as outdoor kids. And so they didn't, you know, another kind of thing about being from Gen X or before is, like, a lot of us were sort of like left outside all day. And it'd be like, you'd come home at the end of the day for dinner, but you were like outside all day. And that's really changed a lot. So that's one piece I want to say, is that like, if you're listening to this and you're like, oh man, they've just gotten started talking, and I realize, like, I'm not noticing any of this stuff. It's like not something that people should feel guilt about. It's sort of like you are an adaptation to your environment, right? And if your environment is urban, it's like a cat living in an apartment is really adapted to that apartment. You know, it's like not the cat's fault that it doesn't know how to live outside if no one lets it outside. So I wonder if you could speak to that, and then I want to kind of go more into to some of these skills. But for people who are like, oh man, wait a second, I'm a mess. Like, where do you start people off? Because people must come in feeling like a little bit broken when they realize, like, how much they don't know.
Yeah, you know, we actually label it kind of in the whole nature connection scene. We call it the wall of grief, you know, and it's a pretty natural place to hit when you realize how much you don't know and what your ancestors might have and where you are today. But, something that I think creates a lot of solace for that wall of grief is exactly what you were saying there, is to say that it's, I wouldn't even say these skills are dormant. You've just been using them in other areas. So we just need to switch your brain patterning over there. But I'm sure every single person listening to this, even if they're feeling a little bit disconnected from nature, they're probably brilliant in something that they do. And they're probably using brain patterning and using their senses in the way that they engage with that, and in the way that allows them to be really good at that thing. So as a mentor, kind of my job is to help people realize that, hey, you're actually built for this. It's in your DNA. You're probably using it already. So we're just going to start doing some subtle things to shift your awareness over to nature. And it's one of my favorite things to do in the world, because it is nothing short of life-changing. When you have people start to see things right in front of them that they've been walking by their entire life and they've never noticed before, I love the look on people's faces. I love the epiphanies that come out, and it literally changes lives when we do it, And the cool thing is, when I think about reconnecting with nature, it's not necessarily about going back in time to now try and, live like our ancestors might have lived wherever we came from in the world, thousands of years ago. It's actually about like creating this amazing hybrid set where we now have this incredible natural awareness. We recognize that we're in an ecosystem, and we're combining that with the best of the modern world and our modern passions as well. And I hope that all of those things lead to us being better stewards, more self-reliant, more capable to adapt to some of the major challenges that we're going to face in the coming years. So I guess that's what I would say to those folks is, all it takes is a couple of shifts in your brain patterning, and suddenly you're going to just dive into an entire world that's so exciting and transformative. So you might not be as far off as you think. And there's some simple steps that we can start to take to get you there.
Yeah, because at the same, you could flip it right around, and we could pull a hunter-gatherer from,
sure we could,
from 40,000 years ago, and it'd be like, good luck trying to, for them, like finding an Uber or navigating a Macy's or, getting on a highway or driving a car or flying, just making their way through the airport. Like they'd be utterly lost. And
even around where I live, man, a lot of the old timers, you put an iPhone in front of them and they can't figure out how to use the swipe thing.
You kids today and your technologies, I don't understand any of it. So I hear that all the time out here. Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. Is like I said, people are adapted to their environment, but their environment is built and now more than ever a virtual environment too. And I think the younger generation especially will be hyper adapted to a social media / virtual and moving into, or augmented kind of reality. And they'll be very adapted to the built environment. But what's important is that we maintain that connection to the natural world too, or at least for those of us who are called to that. Before we move on, I want to just talk about one more thing. And that's, did talk about it briefly. There's that phase I think a lot of people go through when they get attracted, especially people who are interested in wild food or people who get interested in primitive skills. There's that desire. It's kind of like in the yoga world where the romantic thing would be like, I want to go to a cave in India and just practice yoga, like in meditation, and I want to dip out of this world. And you get in the primitive skills world, and boy, you can find some like Instagram accounts, for instance, of people who portray themselves as really doing this stuff, but then you're like, wait a second, you have really nice Instagram pictures, so there's more going on than I'm seeing. But you get that sort of like the person who's recreating and living the primitive lifestyle. And that's like really romantic to me. I mean, a part of me is really drawn to that. Part of me also feels like the world's in crisis, and the work that I do and the work that you do is an important part of the work that needs to be done. We're all contributing to getting through this sort of crisis moment that we're in historically. So I'm wondering about how you balance that. There's that desire to go back. There's that desire to dip out, to tune out, and to go live your sort of like dream life in the woods. There's the harsh realities of the fact that like it's not that possible anymore because the land base isn't there, the eco-diversity isn't there, the community is not there. But there's this sort of balance also of, hey, maybe we need to bring that. It's like, where do I do more good, in the cave meditating or, in the city teaching hundreds of people to meditate? What's more valuable? And then obviously the last piece I'll say is, I think it's important that both are happening. Like I want there to be people who are doing that stuff, but I feel called to be out here and sort of in the front lines doing some of the work with other folks and teaching. But it's not like I don't want people to, like, I wouldn't look at somebody who's living that primitive life in a camp somewhere, remembering these skills. Like I wouldn't be like, well, that's just stupid. It's like, please do that. I think we kind of need people doing everything. But for you personally, how do you view that? Because this is this really weird moment in history where there's a lot of important stuff being lost, and there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen. And then there's a lot of opportunity for distractions into things that might not be beneficial. So how do you see balancing all that?
Yeah, great question. So I would say, so I did do that. And, I was totally guilty. So coming out of my early 20s, realizing all of these possibilities, I totally went into that romantic place of just thinking, I'm going to run away and live in the woods and have this deep connection and be like some whatever, illusion I had of what an ancient indigenous person might look like. And that was a part of my journey for a period of time. And over time, I basically realized that, nature can actually be, one, super harsh as well. And it kind of popped the romantic bubble. And two, if I want to have a relationship with my family and other things, I need to have some connection to the modern world. Three, I started late. I started in my 20s. The environment has changed. So maybe there's an illusion there to begin with around what's even possible. So all of those things are there. But what I've found probably the most important in all of that, and one of the biggest benefits, I think, in learning to track wildlife, developing your natural awareness, like you said, the world is in a really difficult place right now. I'm predicting some really tough challenges for all of humanity in the coming years. And depending on where you live in the world, you're probably seeing them already. My prediction is that some of the places that are very comfortable are probably going to get a little more uncomfortable in the coming years. And there's a lot of social, moral dilemmas that are coming up for us right now. And I think one of the biggest values that come from reconnecting with the land in this powerful way, and maybe even taking a little chunk of time to explore that romantic side, is that nature just mimics so many of the challenges we see in the modern world. I mean, we see harshness and death out there, followed by extreme beauty and zen, almost right back to back. We see killing, and we have to process that. We see, it's just amazing. I can think of so many stories. I remember being down in the jungle. My wife and I went and we were studying survival and wildlife tracking down in the jungle, and stumbling across this group of ants, and they were literally at war. So these leafcutter ants had come and attacked another group of ants. And there's literally these big ants, and they're carrying this one ant. So imagine there's one ant, he's stretched out all of his legs, and these leafcutter ants, there's like 6 of them, like cronies, carrying them along. And literally every once in a while, they drop the ant and they all start dirt kicking them like you'd see in a movie or like in a gang fight. And then they pick them up and they drag them and they drop them and do it again. And I'm like, oh my God, this guy's getting his ass kicked out in nature right now, this ant. Like this, maybe some of our human problems, there's actually something actually natural about them and innate. And so,
man,
I don't want to dive into that one.
I wish we could. You know what I mean? Because there's a lot there, but I mean, it's, I think it's important to know the time and know the place to talk about certain things, but there's a lot of nature denial going on in so many areas right now. But I do think, and I want you to get back to what you were saying prediction-wise and everything. I do think that a lot of the things that are coming are going to help us come back to our senses, because we've gotten out into some way out on the limbs with some of our philosophies. And some of the stuff is very beautiful, but utopian. And you get into nature and you're like, oh yeah, like a lot of this stuff that now I understand, like why some of the things are how they were when I was growing up, or why some of the things I don't love about, our social lives are how they are, because they aren't human constructs. They're natural constructs.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how I'll end without going down that rabbit hole, because I can share a million examples of really crazy things I've seen in nature that actually created metaphors for me and parallels to things I was having trouble processing in the modern world. So I feel like developing this deep awareness for me now, it's not so much about going back in time. It's actually just really understanding the essence of life and conflict and all these things. And nature really actually helps me process how freaking challenging the world is sometimes mentally. And it's really what keeps me sane, And I think about, this epidemic that we're having around depression and anxiety. And I really feel like, if we were able to start people out younger and mentor them these skills and have them have a relationship with nature and be real comfortable and observe some of these things and process death and some of the trauma we have in nature, it gives us like a really powerful skill set to now process those same things in the modern world. And it makes me think about, the quote that I originally made me reach out to you, Daniel, about wanting to come on this podcast. You had posted this picture of yourself catching a brook trout. And you had a quote in there. It went something to the nature of, oh yeah, I've got it in front of me right here. So navigating the fog of chaos requires a compass that is true. It's why being wild fed is about more than just a meal. And to me, that's really what it's about. When we go out into nature, we can see truth. We can see simplicity. It helps us kind of cut away all of this fog, and it helps us process and bring that back to our lives in a more grounded, realistic way. And I just feel like that's so valuable in the context of our kind of unpredictable, changing world right now.
Maybe we could kind of set up for future generations, consider setting up something where it's like before your election, when you run for public office, you have to go do like a 2-week immersion in the nature, before you come back and start campaigning, like something to like
So you know what's real.
straighten your head out. Yeah. So you know what's real, because it seems like the illusion is becoming really, really great. And I guess the reason I use that language is because the chaos does create a sense of fog. And I use the term fog because it's like, hey, I can't even really see 20 yards out in front of me right now, as far as, this idea of like predicting what's going to happen next. Well, when it's this chaotic, it's pretty hard to predict anything. I think looking back to...
Can I interrupt you for a second there? I just thought of sorry, we were on the topic of metaphor there, but here's a perfect example for my own life and thinking about teachings in nature. So many times in modern life, I'm in that place where it feels foggy. It's like, oh my goodness, I can't see what's around the next corner. That's scary. I'm uncomfortable. And I think a lot of people are feeling that in this pandemic right now, like regardless of our beliefs on it all, we don't really know what's around the next corner or this upcoming election, right? I remember getting lost out in the woods once, and I basically hiked back. It was in the dark, and I dropped my flashlight and couldn't find it. So I'd hiked way back into this forest. There was a trail system there, and I had this moment of panic being like, oh my goodness, I have no idea where I am right now. I can't see anything. I can't find my flashlight. What am I going to do? And I start panic, and I basically just sat down and I tapped into that relationship that I had with the natural world to know that, okay, nature's got my back. I just need to use my senses right now. And all of a sudden I had this idea, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take my shoes off right now, which might seem counterintuitive to be lost in a forest in the dark and take your shoes off. And the second I took my shoes off, I stood up and I just kind of started walking around, and suddenly I felt the trail with my bare feet. Yeah. And I was like, oh, it's harder here. Holy cow. And then I just took one slow step and, oh, it's hard here. Oh, this is soft brush. Oh, it's hard here again. And I was able to walk out of the forest blindfolded on the path. If I hadn't taken my shoes off and kind of surrendered to just being okay with not knowing what's beyond that next step, I could have panicked and potentially died that night or been in a really bad situation. My relationship with the land slowing down allowed me to get out of the trail. But then beyond that, I've taken that as a metaphor in life. So now when I'm in this place where it's like, it's really foggy right now, I don't know what's around the next corner, I'm scared, I think back to that time I was out in nature and I didn't know either. And I took off my shoes and I slowed down and I tuned into my senses. And that's actually helped me in a lot of modern problems that I've been in. And it's been helping me in this pandemic as well.
So that's kind of what I was talking about before. I like that a lot because in what I was saying, if you get into the survivalist, preppery kind of world, the solutions are often wall yourself in, and you look at that when you have especially as people who hunt, fish, or forage, the way we accomplish that is by putting our tendrils out, and connecting in and plugging in to things. So the idea of walling yourself up looks like a bad strategy to me. Maybe it's like that, emergency medicine. It's like good in the short term if you're in a really bad scenario, but it doesn't seem like long term. And so, most survival books would not recommend if you're lost at night to take your shoes off, right? You and I both know that. They would probably never say that. But as people who have a connection to nature and that kind of trust in nature, man, it's interesting. That makes a lot of sense to me. So that's kind of like what I would like to see more of a blending of what the people who integrate into nature understand into the preparedness we need for the future. Talk to me a little bit about tracking. I want people to understand what it is and how it's valuable, and especially for people who are like, well, why would I ever, I don't see any need for that in my life. And I'm going to add a little more to that if you don't mind. It's this thing where I teach a lot of people, how to get started, let's say hunting. And it's not a instead of taking a big comprehensive, we're starting at level 1 big ecology deep dive. Instead, I'll be like, man, let me just teach you about turkeys. I'm going to teach you a bunch of stuff about turkeys. I'm going to show you turkey sign. We're going to go look at where turkeys hang out. Where are they roosting? What are they doing during the day? What are they eating? And I'll kind of do like a single species deep dive. Now, the benefit of that is you can get out there and learn really fast and be successful at harvesting turkeys. The downside is it takes a lot longer if you approach everything one piece at a time to put the big picture together. So I'm curious, like, how you make sense of what I just said there, and how could tracking help somebody who maybe just forages, or maybe they hunt, but they're just like, I just hunt deer. Like, why would I want to know about everything else? Like, how is tracking useful outside of just finding animals, and why would people want to learn more about it?
Awesome. Yeah, there's quite a bit there. So if I missed something, feel free to pull me back to it there. So the way that when I first started to track, originally it was just like, okay, I just want to kind of know what footprints belong to which animal. And that's what I thought tracking is. And, jump forward 20 years, like that's just like the absolute tip of the iceberg. And tracking is, again, just kind of like hunting has completely transformed who I am as a person and how I see the world. And I apply tracking to my business, to reaching my goals, just as much as I do to my hunting skills, or even seeing and photographing animals now. And, maybe the best way I've heard it kind of explain this broader sense of what we mean by tracking, what's below the waterline, you could say, if we're looking at the tip of the iceberg there, is that everything is a track. A tree is a track, for example. So a tree has a ton of information in it. It might be telling us about, which way the dominant wind's blowing from. And we can see that in the formation and the shapes of the branches. It might tell us what direction south is, again, by the growth of the branches and the patterns in it. It might tell us about the quality of the soil. It might tell us how deep the water table is. It might tell us about animals that are in the area. Like, there's so much information in one individual tree once you've had that turned on. So a tracker is really somebody that's reading all of the clues of life, all the clues of the past and the present, and they're making predictions and hypotheses about the future. So animal prints are a really great starting point. And, when I'm teaching someone to track, I don't dive into these big philosophical pieces here. I actually start kind of like you gave the example with hunting there. It's like, okay, well, let's start by going and tracking a raccoon or tracking a fox. And we're going to look at every little detail, and we're going to really work on the way that our mind processes that information. And we're going to start to establish search images. We're going to start to establish patterns in that person's brain. But once we've started to, form some of those neural networks, and they've established this basic patterning and the methodology for approaching tracking, suddenly you can start to do it in other areas really, really quickly and effectively. So now you're able to move into a new ecosystem, a new animal, and learn it way faster than you did with that last species, I'd imagine if you took somebody to do that with turkey with them, and then you did it with migratory birds, well, by the time you got to grouse, they're going to be picking it up way faster, right? Yeah. It's kind of funny. I think I told this to you in a past conversation we had, but I'm a college professor. I teach a class called Applied Ecology, where we dive into bird language and tracking. And I actually say to my students, one of the questions on your final exam is going to be, what have you learned from tracking raccoons this summer that can help you get your dream job in life? And I apply the skill sets of tracking, as I said, everywhere in the world right now, because tracking is really about pattern recognition, and it's about the methodology of asking questions and forming hypotheses about the ecosystem that we're in. And everything is an ecosystem. An office is just as much as a forest. So there's so many different layers to that there. But, it's all in the footprint. And if you have a really good mentor that teaches you how to approach a set of new prints for the first time, and what types of questions to ask, what to look at, what in your brain to not actually listen to right off the bat and to pull in later, and you develop the mindset, the search images, the methodology, then, suddenly you go from tracking raccoons to like tracking your own brain process and your relationships and your goals and how you achieve them, if that kind of makes sense. I don't know if I got too kind of philosophical for you there, or if the thread between those two places is clear.
No, that's kind of what I'm talking about, because I think that for people to really get invested in the idea, it has to be useful in a lot of areas, for a lot of people. How can you explain a little bit for somebody who's never really been exposed to tracking? first of all, kind of like, what do we know historically about it? I actually would like to ask you several questions about tracking. So let's start there so I don't inundate you with questions as I want to do. But like, give me some sort of backstory historically and what impact tracking may have had on the development of people as we know them today.
We'll get right back to the show in a moment, but first, let me tell you about Earth Runners and their groundbreaking line of adventure sandals. Earth Runners are based on the ancestral sandal design known as the Huarache, but they've updated them with Vibram soles and an innovative grounding system, which uses electrically conductive laces and a copper plug in the sole to connect a circuit between you and the ground, just like when you're barefoot. And there's some interesting science looking at the effects of being electrically grounded on your health. Here's a few lines from an abstract of a 2015 paper titled "The Effects of Grounding, Earthing, on Inflammation, the Immune Response, Wound Healing, and Prevention and Treatment of Chronic Inflammatory and Autoimmune Diseases." Quote, "Multidisciplinary research has revealed that electrically conductive contact of the human body with the surface of the earth, grounding or earthing, produces intriguing effects on physiology and health. Such effects relate to inflammation, immune response, wound healing, and prevention and treatment of chronic inflammatory and autoimmune diseases. Earth Runners reminds you that most shoes are insulators, disconnecting you from the ground. Get grounded. You can learn more at earthrunners.com, where the coupon code WildFed always gets you 10% off your order. Now, back to the show.
There's fascinating research you can look around for on tracking in the development of the human brain, because again, it's pattern recognition, right? So the way that it's actually formulated our brains over time, having to put together complex problems, looking at the ground. I don't want to dive too much into that right now, but historically, you could say that all people at one time were trackers. You couldn't survive without being a tracker. And whether that's you were going out to, find that deer to harvest to bring back to your people to eat, or someone's got hurt and you need to find medicine. So an example here, let's say, we're out in the forest and you get stung by a bee or a wasp. I won't say bee. My wife would kill me for saying bee. You got stung by a wasp. And I want to find a particular herb to put on that. Or, you've got poison ivy, or you've cut yourself, or you've got a sore stomach, whatever it is. You could randomly walk around the landscape and hope you just stumble across that plant or that medicine. Or you could think like a tracker who's going to maybe climb up a tree or get up on a vantage point and literally track the landscape and say, okay, when I look at the dips and the valleys and I look at the, where the sun is and how it moves across the landscape, I look at the different cover types of trees, where in this landscape, what are the tracks that are associated with that plant that I want to harvest? Maybe it's a wetland plant that you want and you're looking off in the distance, okay, I see a little bit of a divot right there. And, those look like the crown of willows over there. Or up where I am, it's often the hemlocks are either up on the ridges or they're all in the wetland valleys. Yellow birch trees grow in the wetland. So maybe I'm up on a ridge and I'm like, okay, I don't actually see the water, but I see a yellow birch tree over there. That's my track that there's potentially water over there. And I know this plant that I want to go harvest jewelweed for your bee sting, let's say, or your wasp sting. Well, I see, okay, there's a yellow birch. So instead of just randomly walking, looking for my jewelweed, I head to the yellow birch, I find the water, and sure enough, I know jewelweed grows by the water. I find the jewelweed, I've got my plant there, right? So it's kind of a methodology for actually reading the landscape that can be applied to just about anything.
I recently went and saw Tenet, the recent film that came out. Or you know what I'm talking about by any chance?
I haven't seen that one, no.
Anyway, it's a Christopher Nolan film, and so it's messing, it's sort of like looking at time, and as he's done in many of his films, and it was this idea of past, present, future stuff that they're playing with, and there's this thing in science fiction and kind of in the new age too, where they like to talk about how we perceive time as linear, but maybe time isn't linear. And whenever I hear that, I'm kind of like, well, I don't know, man. I mean, time seems pretty linear to me. But anyway, I wonder if our general consensus of linear time, how much it's been impacted by tracking, because it's very easy for us to perceive time as past, present, future, because we've grown up with those concepts. But you imagine an animal, do they think about past and future? Or do they live in the present? We struggle a lot to live in the present because we think a lot about past and future. But you can imagine early humans, as we sort of leave the world of the present as animals and become what we know of today as modern humans, like how much looking at tracks made you go, oh, this is what happened before in that direction. In other words, the tracks came from there. So in the past, the animal was down that way, and the tracks are here now and they go this way. That's the future over there where he's headed. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, do you think our understanding of time was impacted by tracking? And do you think that sort of our ability to formulate hypotheses about the future and make predictions comes out of tracking?
Anyone that's questioning whether that's reality or not, and I'll just say that 100% that's reality, should watch the movie The Great Dance. Have you seen that one? By Craig Foster about the Kalahari Bushmen and their connection with tracking with the land.
So powerful.
Yeah, and it's basically demonstrating exactly what you're talking there, showing their ability to look into the past and look into the future through this skill set, and also just glean they live in an ecosystem where there's lions. So to be able to look at the ground and know that, hey, the lion comes around at this time every single day. Okay, maybe I'm not going to be here at this time every single day. Like super relevant life data for staying alive. And they're able to say so past lion came yesterday at this time. Oh, that might mean today or tomorrow the lion's going to be here at that same time. That's really helpful. So I'm going to think ahead a little bit about that, and it's going to influence my movement.
Did you see My Octopus Teacher?
I did. I just watched that the other night. I'm mind blowing. And that actually is Craig Foster, the same guy that produced the movie The Great Dance. That's kind of his story of his own deep connection journey under the sea. Fascinating.
That's what was so interesting. So when the movie started, everyone kept saying, hey, you got to see this. And I was it looked a little pretentious to me, to be honest. I was like, I don't know, So I started, and then I realized, oh, he's the guy that made that film. Like, he shot that. Because I've watched that many times. You're talking about they follow those San folks who are persistence hunting for a kudu, I believe. And you get to really see them track their way after this animal for hours. It's just incredible. Then I realized, oh, it's him who's talking. Oh, fantastic. And then it gets to that point where he loses the octopus and he starts tracking it. And there's quite a nice section of that film. So I'm curious, when you were watching that, how that landed for you when you realized, oh, this guy's doing free diving undersea tracking below sea level.
Yeah, it's applicable to anything. And, I've never done it undersea, but something, a friend of ours, I think a mutual friend of ours, there's a gentleman named Dan Gardoki, runs an organization called Lead with Nature, a really fascinating guy. He's been a mentor of mine in tracking for a number of years. And something I've been chatting with him lately, I've been a fisherman my whole life, but I've never actually thought about tracking underwater like I track on land, the way that I track animals, or the way that I track humans, or the way that I track the weather. So Dan's actually been really pushing me the last little while to hey, Chris, what would it look like if you thought about being a tracker underwater? I just got back from a 10-day interior canoe trip with my wife. And I basically went out there and we base camped for 6 days on this lake. And I just geeked out the entire week being like, okay, with my fishing rod and my observation of the landscape and asking good questions, how much can I learn about what's underwater and what the bottom of this lake looks like and the ecology of that? And how can it lead me to actually be a better fisherman and a better naturalist and a better person, And that was kind of the question that I went out on that trip with. And it was so fascinating how much I learned. And basically what I wanted to do, I didn't want to bring any underground maps. I didn't want to bring a fish finder. And my goal was okay, I know there's lake trout in here, but I've heard they're really hard to catch because the underground habitat only allows them to be in a very small part of this lake. So without any human implements or any knowledge of where it is, I'm going to basically track the bottom of this lake and see if I can't figure out where and when and how to catch a lake trout. And sure enough, it was day 5, the day before we're about to head out. And I finally nailed my lake trout. And I was so kind of stoked and proud of myself for that, to basically be applying the skill set of tracking underneath the water. And can I share one other quick little story from that trip that I think I'm thinking about, for people that are listening and still wondering, okay, maybe you're not a hunter, and you're still thinking about, well, what's the application of tracking to me? And I shared that story a minute ago. Well, if you're a forager, it's just as relevant, because tracking will tell you where the plants are on the landscape that you want to go get. You can track landscapes. But if you just like camping and getting outdoors, I had this other really neat experience. So the very first morning, I get up before the sun rises and I paddle way to the north end of the lake. My wife's still asleep. And I was just having a fun time. I was out there with my fishing rod, cast in, caught a beautiful pike that morning. And it's, 10 o'clock in the morning, and I turn around to paddle back, and this incredibly intense wind is coming out of the south. And I actually really struggled to get back to our campsite. I was giving it everything I had. I get out to the middle of the lake, the wind catches me, it flips my canoe around. I'm already exhausted. And I actually hit this moment of fear for a moment, being like, oh my God, my wife is on that island by herself. She doesn't have a canoe. Like, I have to get back there, and I'm struggling right now. So I pushed really hard. I finally got back to the island. I was absolutely exhausted. And I was like, oh my goodness, like, I'm kind of afraid to go over to the north side of the lake again and getting stuck like that. Because what if that went wrong? It could have been really bad. And really interesting. So the next couple of mornings, I basically stayed closer to our island because of this wind kept coming out of the south, and it was picking up just after the sun every day. So it's about the fourth morning of our trip. It's actually fifth morning, because this is the morning I caught the lake trout. And I hadn't paddled over there on my own again yet because I was afraid of getting stuck. That night, during the night, all night long, I'm hearing ducks way off in the distance. We hadn't heard a migratory bird the entire week. We had the strong wind coming out of the south. The birds just weren't moving, particularly not migrating south when the wind's blowing out of the south. That night, we had these gentle, gentle gusts out of the north. And sure enough, that's what the birds caught on their migration. We wake up, there's 100 mallards off in the distance on this lake. And so I get up that morning and I'm sitting there looking at it, and I'm like, okay, you know what? I'm going to go to the north side of the lake. I'm going to do it again. I'm pretty confident from tracking the weather, tracking the birds. Those migratory birds, those mallards, they wouldn't have landed on this lake and settled in here for the day if there was going to be a harsh wind blowing all day. They'd go and land in a little wetland where they're protected. So now the birds are telling me, okay, it's actually safe for you to paddle to the north end of the lake again and go fish some more over there. And that's where I caught the the lake trout that morning. But there's just a neat example of like tracking the landscape, how it actually applied to my safety as a person just camping and fishing in the backcountry.
That's a fantastic story, man. And I'm also curious if you ate that lake trout.
Oh, we sure did. We also we came across some trumpet mushrooms that same day.
Oh yeah.
And here we go, bridging modern world and old world. So I harvested this lake trout. My wife went and got us some trumpet mushrooms. We also brought in some like amazing cheese and some really nice bread. So we cooked up the lake trout, put it on the bread with the fried trumpet mushrooms, put cheese on it, melted by the fire. Oh my goodness. Best of both worlds, buddy.
I love it. I like lake trout. A lot of people here in Maine call them mud hens, and they say they're not good to eat. And it's just like,
what?
To me, I know. I think they're fantastic. What? Yeah, I really like them too. So I don't know what people are talking about. But all right, so back to tracking. Another thing I would like for you to share a little bit about is the difference between going, identifying, hey, that's the track of a bear or a deer or a field mouse, and the difference between just knowing the track and understanding what that individual animal might be doing at that time. Particularly, I guess it's kind of like saying, it's like the difference of somebody who's, let's say, has got some mastery in body language, and there's, hey, that person's smiling, that's a big gross muscle movement in their face. And then being able to really read micro expressions of the mimetic muscles in the face. There's two different skills, right? So somebody might be able to be really good at being like, that's a raccoon track, but not necessarily understand much about what that animal is doing. So can you explain about little micro impressions in a track that can give info? I want people to understand at an advanced level what can be understood from looking at just one or two tracks.
Yeah, awesome question. So when you'd kind of just ask me about what tracking was a little while ago, I said when I started out, that was what I thought tracking was. Like, let's look at a print and identify who it was. And for me, that was actually exciting in and of itself. But it wasn't until I started learning those micro nuances that I was like, mind blowing wide open. Like, oh my goodness, I want to dedicate my life to this. Because it's so fascinating how much information is in a single track or in a pattern or series of tracks. So there's something that we teach, my one course that I teach, Nature's Forgotten Language. We get a little bit into the world of what we call gait interpretation. So it's like looking at a series of tracks and knowing what that animal is doing based on the patterns it leaves. And all animals will have what we call like your baseline gait or your harmonious gait. So it's like the way that animal usually moves through the landscape. And where this becomes kind of exciting for someone that starts to learn the track is if you've looked at, let's say, I'll pick a wolf, for example. If you've looked at a wolf track enough times, you'll start to realize, okay, this is kind of like how spaced apart the prints are. This is the pattern that it's usually in. Suddenly, if there is any reason that it's not moving in that pattern you normally see, now that you know that there's a story to be told there. And in that story, I mean, everything from like head direction to even the emotional state that the animal was in when it made that track is registered there. It's so fascinating. And you can apply it to people the same way that you can apply it to animals. Maybe just to give kind of two little quick stories there. I remember having this experience once. I'm walking, this is my early days of tracking, and I'm walking on this trail and I see a doe off in the distance. She stops and looks at me. And it was the first time I'd ever had a deer snort at me and not run away. Up until that point in my life, almost every time I'd seen a deer, they just took off running. So this deer snorts and stomps its foot. And I'm kind of like, oh my goodness, what? She didn't just run, she's snorting. What's this all about? She does it a couple more times. And then all of a sudden she just takes off. And I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. And I'm really getting into tracking at this time. And I had this thought of being like, I wonder if like I was a person following those deer prints, if I wouldn't be able to actually piece together this story. And I like teaching this story with a whiteboard so I can draw it for people, but I'll do my best to explain it. Imagine you're following a deer trail, and they're in this pattern we call a diagonal walk, meaning your back foot is landing on top of the front foot, and they're kind of in a diagonal pattern. You're walking along, and all of a sudden you see two prints side by side. It's the first time in 100 yards you've seen two prints side by side, and you say, oh, that's what we call a T-step. The deer stop right here. And then all of a sudden there's a cluster of tracks all close together, and they're deeper. Oh, the deer stomped its feet. Well, now that's telling me about the emotional state the deer was in. The deer's actually agitated right now. To even back up a step, you could go to that initial T-step and then go look at the micro ridges inside of that track and actually say, okay, when the deer stopped, what did they do? Did they look over their right shoulder or their left shoulder? And, let's say they looked over the left shoulder, because you see that it's way deeper on that front left side of the track. And there's a bit of a ridge on the front left and the rear right of the track. You get these little micro ridges of sand. Now it looked over its left shoulder, so you go walking over to the left and you see, okay, can I figure out what that deer was looking at? So that's actually what happened on this day. I'm following it. I find where it stomps. I find where it takes off. And then you could walk over and you find that person. You're like, okay, the deer looked off to the left. They saw the person. Oh, the person stopped because now their feet are side by side. Now I actually connect the dots, the moment in time when the deer saw the person and the person saw the deer. And to make a long story short, I go tracking around because I've still got this mystery question. And here's where, the art of questioning is so important in developing our relationship with nature, because a lot of people might see, the deer and the person, and if you don't ask any questions, there's nothing to it. There's no learning there. But I actually asked the question, well, why did the deer stop and stomp? I've never seen this before. I want to solve that question. So I go looking or tracking in the direction where the deer had bounded away. And sure enough, I find a fawn. And realize instantly, wow, that's why the deer stopped and stomped. There was a fawn nearby. She was buying time for the fawn to go away. So now I go and backtrack the fawn, and sure enough, you can find where the fawn is diagonally walking, and then suddenly two prints side by side. It made the T-step. And now my hypothesis as a tracker is I bet you that T-step happened at the exact same time the mama did that initial snort. So now I know when in time the person saw the deer saw the person, the deer snorted, fawn heard the snort. She does her T-step, she stops and listens for a half second. The fawn bounds away, and sure enough, she tucks into some brush and lays down. And I bet you when she laid down was when the deer stopped snorting and ran away. And what was the real big breakthrough for me in that moment is like I witnessed all of that, not the fawn part, but the interaction with the deer. But as a tracker, I could actually come there, and that entire story is written on the landscape for me to put together, including the emotional state of the deer. When was the deer feeling threatened? When did it feel relaxed again? When did the deer stop from hiding or running and go back to just like feeding and grazing again? And now again, I know the actual emotional state that the deer was in has actually changed. So you can literally track the emotions of an animal, but also very physical things like head direction, speed of travel. And whenever there's a shift in any of those, there's actually a reason for that. And we can put that together as an actual story. And I'll just leave that story with saying you can apply that same thing to humans in a very practical and useful way as well.
Man, I love that. Thank you. That's a really great example of what I was trying to say. I haven't done a lot of tracking, but in the classes that I've been in, I've been amazed at the story that can be built up from what appears to be very little information. And also, we've been talking about sort of how this kind of thing can have parallel values in the built and virtual environments too. And I want to talk about that for a second. I did a counter tracking class, and that was very interesting to me. The idea of trying to not leave some of that information behind. And as we go into the virtual world more and more, there's going to be such a premium on our ability to understand what we're leaving behind. to be tracked. So I was wondering if you could speak to, first of all, what this term spore means in the tracking world, and then how tracking's made you aware of the impressions you register in landscapes. Not even maybe from like an invasive perspective, but just from an awareness perspective of what you're leaving behind. Because, I'm thinking back to my friend Mike Douglas from the Maine Primitive Skills School was the first person to really do this for me. He pulled me aside, and there was a beer can recently empty and crushed on the ground. And he said, let's try to figure this story out. And he ends up building up for me the most compelling story of this person, and they're taking a piss over here to the left as they drink this beer and crush the can. And then he built it up for me in such a way that I was like, we were looking back in time. And I'm sure that person never imagined that they had left this story behind to linger. Right. So could you speak to that a little bit? What is spore, and how much information are we leaving on the landscape?
Yeah, awesome. To really simplify spore, you could kind of think of yourself as like Sherlock Holmes being a tracker, and spore is really the clue that we're looking at when we're out in the natural world. So the spore could be the track itself, like the shape of the footprint. It could be the broken twig. It could be that beer can that was sitting on the ground there. So really, it's kind of the clue that we're going to read, and then we're putting together all those multiple different clues into a story. And I guess, the parallel around what we leave behind, the more you realize how much you can read from the landscape, the more you just become highly aware of the trail that you're leaving behind. And it really just brings up those questions around like, okay, well, how much of a trail do I want to leave behind? And I don't know if I want to dive into the digital world, but like my tracking of wildlife and my application of counter tracking, and counter tracking, for those that aren't familiar, is kind of like, how do I not leave the tracks? If someone's tracking me, how do I be close to invisible out on the landscape? So once you start practicing counter tracking out in the natural world, a very natural progression is to start thinking about that in life as well, knowing that, sometimes there's people out there with malicious intentions. And, most criminals, the same way that I would think about hunting a deer, I want to start tracking it. I want to learn as much as I can about it. And I'm basically going to find where that deer gets into some sense of a rut. Where it starts being complacent in its awareness. And my chances of hunting and harvesting that deer successfully significantly go up when I find that rut, that complacency. And I can find that through the patterns in the tracks. Well, a criminal is going to do that same thing, as would an investigator, from the police force. They're basically going to start tracking that individual, whether if you're casing somebody out to rob their house, and you basically find the pattern, you find the rut. This is an intelligent criminal, obviously. And once you found that rut, then you exploit it for your own advantage. So once you understand that and you start practicing counter tracking out in the natural world, it's a pretty natural progression to start thinking about counter tracking just in your day-to-day life and how you go about. And it also makes you aware of, how if you're in a vulnerable place, that you're leaving a story of that behind you. The more you learn to be able to pick up on the stories of your friends and the people around you through tracking, the more you realize, oh, someone else could do that through me. And if I've got a rut that I don't want exposed right now, maybe I want to think about being a counter tracker in my day-to-day movement. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, it does, man. Because I'm just thinking about the other day, I'm at the ATM, and it's like one of those ATMs where you got to put your card in to get in a little room, and there's a garbage can right there where everybody puts their ATM slips. And one's fallen on the floor, and I pick it up, and it shows the person has like $150,000 in that bank account. It's got their name and the last 4 digits of their bank account. Now, the first 6 digits of the bank account, we all share. So there's not that much missing information here. And I'm thinking, with that much money in your bank account, you're going to leave that slip there. Some opportunistic predator has quite a bit of information from that. Like, how long does it take them to track down more? You know what I'm saying? It's like one of those kind of things where sometimes I don't think people are realizing, that deer might not realize what information it's leaving for you, right? And so in that way, I think sometimes some of us could be more tidy with some of the things that we do. And so I think it's really beneficial in that way too. Talk to me a little bit about, I guess there's 2 things. I want to talk about how somebody who wants to learn more, and we've kind of focused a lot on tracking. You spoke earlier about bird language, which I think is another one of those just really incredible skill sets, the auditory equivalent, I guess, of tracking. How do people get started if they want to learn some of this stuff? And then let's say somebody's like, well, I'm not really going to go down that road. That's a little more advanced, but I want to work on my general awareness. So maybe you could speak to both. Like if somebody's like, I want to get into tracking, give us some sort of answers on that. And then if they want to just develop general awareness, what are some exercises or skills or practices that they could do to begin to tune in a little bit more to their senses?
Awesome. Yeah. I'm going to start with the awareness one there because I love it. And, the way that I approach the world, whether it's survival skills or starting a business, awareness is your first step. So I'll start with awareness there, and then we'll add the tracking part second, which is starting to work on the actual tactics. So developing awareness, there's a couple I would call kind of powerhouse moves or things you can do around that. And, I'll share a resource that actually I offer. So I have a paid course called Survive the Storms, but people can sign up for the first lesson absolutely free. And in that course, they can actually in the first lesson, it's all about developing situational awareness. And you can download a free audio sense meditation that you then, you download on your phone and you go out and you sit in a public park or sit downtown in the city, sit on the subway, obviously thinking about the pandemic and all that stuff. But basically, you can go and download this for free at survivethestorms.com and listen to this track, and it'll help you just trigger your brain around the kinds of things you might want to think about when developing your awareness. Beyond that, or if you don't want to take that step, the other things that I'd like to recommend are creating a trigger. So we want to snap ourselves out of the normal patterns we have and the normal things that we pay attention. So the trigger that I actually use on my phone, I have a little sticker of a star, and it's actually stuck up in the top corner of my phone. And every time my phone rings, phones are one of those things that generally pull away from our awareness. We pick up our phone and we go into it to either talk to someone or look up a piece of information, check our email, check our social media. Every time I look at my phone, and I actually change the sticker from time to time because otherwise I just get complacent about it. But every time I see that sticker, it's a reminder of hey, you can hold awareness while being on your phone. So now my phone's ringing, but maybe before I answer, I just actually look up for a second and I skim the landscape really quickly. I go to check my email, but I'm like, while I'm checking my email, I'm going to keep listening to all the sounds around me and notice if somebody's loud footsteps are coming close to me or notice if there's birds calling. So create some sort of trigger for yourself that basically challenges you to bring yourself into awareness on a regular basis. The next tool that I would add to that one is having a journal. And, maybe I'd like to do pick kind of themes. So you could just say, okay, maybe for the next little bit, I want to focus on weather and birds. And I'm going to use my trigger. So every time I see my trigger, I'm just going to listen and say, okay, what birds do I hear right now? And which way is the wind blowing from? And where is the sun? And what are the clouds doing? And then that night, you go and just write down a couple of notes about that. And it's amazing how the trigger in combination with a journal over time starts to build your awareness in such a powerful way. What you could do is actually even give yourself a bunch of headings in your journal. It's okay, there's the sun, there's the clouds, there's the birds, there's people, and all these things. And what you'll find is if you were to go every day or a couple times a week, go hit up that journal, you'll find that there's certain things that you just don't pay attention to. But if every single day you get that reminder, oh man, I didn't pay attention to the wind again today. Oh geez, another day went by, I didn't look at the wind. Frick, tomorrow there's no way I'm not going to pay attention to the wind when I'm outside. So having those categories in your journal can really push you to actually just start noticing those things. I journaled for years about that. And once you've done it long enough, it just becomes who you are. And now you can get rid of the journal. And that's just what you're thinking about all the time, everywhere you go. And that's what we start to call kind of situational awareness or natural awareness. And then maybe one last one, which this can apply to both tracking as well as the awareness one. Whether you live in a city or in the countryside, try and stalk and track deer. See if you can't watch deer without them seeing you watching them. And, I'm not talking about the deer in the farm field that comes out to feed on the corn every night. I'm not talking about the deer that comes out in the middle of the city park. Go into the forest, even an urban forest, and see if you can't track, trail, and sneak up on a deer. You're going to learn so much about awareness in that process because deer are absolutely brilliant. So that's my answer for awareness. And then let me share a couple of steps for tracking. Tracking is really about asking really good questions and trying to hold back all the information that we think we know about something. That's kind of our biggest crutch when we're trackers. We have this past life experience and we like to look at a piece of information and we want to pat ourselves on the back and feeling oh yeah, I know something about that. I was right about that. Get rid of the ego, get rid of the need to know. and get rid of past life experience, put that all on hold and just look at something super objectively. Okay, what's the shape of it? So you're looking at a footprint on the ground and you might start with saying, okay, well, what's the general shape? Okay, I'm going to count the number of toes in there. Is one side of the track deeper than the other side of the track? Just think of as many questions you can possibly ask about that track. Then zoom out a little bit and say, okay, now I'm going to do that same questioning about the environment around it. So what's the weather doing? What's the substrate? What's the ecosystem in right now? Ask as many questions as you can, and then you take your past life experience and your thoughts and you try and overlay them on it. I think that's one of the things that we often are guilty of in this modern world is we get a little bit of information and then we very quickly want to put our judgments and our opinions on it. And being a tracker is about taking in as much information as possible and completely ignoring our opinions and our judgments until we've gotten as much information as possible and then overlaying them so we didn't miss anything. So for tracking,
it's a lot like science, really, isn't it?
It is. Tracking, I make the argument that I think tracking is the first science. And all other science come out of the art of tracking,
right?
Of following animals to get our food or reading the weather.
I hope people who haven't really considered that before take some time over the coming days to really consider what you mean by that. Because as you sit with that concept and you think back to the earliest human origins, you realize oh yeah, that tracking thing might be the origin of a lot of these unique human abilities that we have. And, watching how other animals can't see tracks is very fascinating. You start to understand there's something really special about human cognition. My dog is very good at staying on a track, but through olfactory sense. But my dog does not look at a track and is not then able to comprehend what she's seeing. And I don't know if there's any other animals that can do that, but I suspect not, that visually track. I don't know if you know anything about that, but I would imagine this is pretty unique to humans.
Yeah, I think, a lot of animals, and you know what, I honestly think it's going to vary from one species to another. And I think some species may have more awareness of tracks than others, but I think it's often through their other senses, Mm-hmm. When I'm out hunting, it's amazing how often, I'll go, I'm super cold and I go in to take a little hour break to warm up. And sure enough, that's when that big buck comes in and he sniffs out my track and he sniffs out the tree stand I was in. And then he disappears before I get back there. I can't tell you how many times that deer I've been stalking for weeks shows up in the 1 hour I went to go take a break and warm up. But he's tracking me. He knows I was there. He didn't show up when I was in that tree stand because as I'm tracking him, looking for his ruts, he's doing the same thing for me and he's tracking me as well. So I do think animals track, but maybe not in the same visual way that we humans do. And just to finish that answer there around, getting started in tracking, Daniel, in case that was a little bit confusing to people, just to really simplify it. So start with animal footprints. That's a great way to do it. Go out and ask questions, as many as you can, and just know that it's not so much about the answer of the question. It's about asking questions, forming a hypothesis, and then trying to prove it right or wrong over time. So you can go out, ask all these questions, then you go back and you look at a book, you jump on a Facebook page about tracking, you talk to a friend about it, and they either confirm that you were right about your theory or they challenge it and say, oh, I was wrong. And just give up on the idea of you're going to have an answer in the short term. I've had lots of tracking mysteries that literally took me years to get to the answer. And in our modern world where we're obsessed with short-term results, I actually think there's a lot of value in kind of surrendering to the long-term journey of learning things really, really well. And if you've been looking for the answer to something for years and you finally come across it, it's so much rewarding than oh, I just flicked on my phone and took a picture and it told me that was a raccoon. Cool. That's nothing, Whereas if you were trying to figure out who is that animal that comes around every night and gets into my garbage and you honestly don't know, and you're searching and you're looking for clues, and then you start realizing, okay, well, I think, because of whatever reason it comes by at this time most nights, I'm going to sneak out tomorrow night and I'm going to sit there and watch. And then you sit there and he's not there, and then you try it again. And then finally, after all this work, you see it and you're oh, it's a raccoon. Or no, it wasn't a raccoon. It's actually a possum. I thought it was a raccoon the whole time. I was wrong. Who cares that you were wrong? It's this journey of asking questions and trying to prove them right or wrong in a scientific and objective way that develops the neural pathways and the brain patterning that then make us really good trackers and able to apply that lesson from the raccoon to reaching my goals in life or staying safe or those million other different pieces. That's where the parallels from nature cross over.
How important do you think finding a mentor is, and is it fairly easy to find folks who teach this stuff?
Yeah, how did I not mention that one? Yeah, finding a mentor, like anything, is absolutely huge too, and that's been a huge part of my journey as well, is working with people that just showed me, like I gave that example of my wife being like, you've never seen a Kia before. Sometimes you're just not going to see things until someone points them out. And a mentor is so helpful in that. And a good mentor is probably going to ask you questions that you never would have thought to even ask before. And the more you get used to like these out of the box questions, the more you learn how to actually ask them yourselves. So for both the awareness and the tracking one, I would say finding a mentor is actually a huge piece in both of those. And for sure, they're out there. There's all kinds of schools out there that run tracking courses and natural awareness courses. There's all kinds of resources that are written, field guides. There's groups online. There's local tracking clubs. So definitely get out with other people that know what they're doing. But don't think that not having a mentor or not knowing anything about nature is a barrier. Because literally, I gave you the formula there. It's asking good questions, it's being curious, it's being passionate, and it's about giving up on the time and the need to know by the end of the day. Like that's the formula there. And then if you add a mentor to that, man, you're talking about developing superhuman skills over the next 20 years.
Talk to me a little bit about the programs that you have. And I know that you've got to offer for the listeners here. I really want to make sure they understand like what the courses are that you have, because they're pretty exciting. I think a lot of people here are going to be like, oh, they're juicy. And they cover two really important needs, stuff we've been talking about. So talk to us about what you developed. And in particular, tell us about how those courses are set up, because they're really unique offerings, stuff I haven't really seen people do before.
Yeah, well, the first one is called Nature's Forgotten Language. And the idea behind this course was basically thinking about my journey, spending my whole life in the outdoors. And then at the age of 20, realizing like, oh my goodness, there's this entire language in front of me. And I've been oblivious to it, even though it's right in front of my face. And then I went on this 20-year journey of like, how do I turn that on for myself? And how do I turn that on for others? And I really, as a teacher, I've really enjoyed looking at how do we make the most out of our online platforms and really create kind of, again, the best of both worlds, because there's nothing like being out in the woods with a live mentor. But there's some things I can actually teach and show better online. So when I filmed Nature's Forgotten Language, I actually worked with a professional wildlife videographer. And we've got some amazing clips in there, where we can actually show a track from different angles, and I can piece together stories really, really clearly, and give people tools that allow them to go out and see things that I might struggle showing if we're in a big group out in the woods. But then the other component that we add to that is, when I first started that course, I used to have it as a standalone online course. And a lot of people just really struggled with accountability when there wasn't someone pushing you, and they missed the relationship piece. So now all my online course, Nature's Forgotten Language, we basically have like the go at your own pace, these professional recorded videos that walk you through all of these awareness routines that you can do in the city, you can do in the country, you can do in the wilderness to basically teach you how to start observing nature in kind of the way we've been referencing this entire way, reading the weather, knowing what the birds are saying, knowing not only that that's a bear, but the bear actually stopped and it looked over its left shoulder and there was a reason for that. So we basically walk you through those in these pre-recorded stuff, but then twice a year, I do a recorded session that's live, or sorry, not a recorded session, a live session via Zoom, where we pull all the students in, and anyone that signed up in the last year or the last 6 months can come to these live sessions, and we basically go through the course together every 2 weeks. I do a call, and then I do kind of additional teaching beyond what we offer in the course. It's a chance for questions and answers. We'll do breakout rooms so the students can chat with students. A big part of learning is even being able to like share your passion and your interests and have that captured. I don't know if you've ever had that experience where like, you're really excited about something and no one in your life cares, and it kind of just kills that flame.
Yeah, I've had that plenty.
So, I try and build that into the way I design the courses so that you can actually get excited. And, there's something about that collective group coming together to learn something that actually makes everybody's learning exponential. So I try to build that into both my courses. So, and anyways, just to kind of simplify that for us. So Nature's Forgotten Language, there's these go at your own pace modules, but they're really well thought out in how to mentor the best through them, filmed professionally. And then there's also the live classes, and then there's a workbook. And through the workbook, you're given these activities to go out into the natural world to expand your awareness. We look at things like tracking and identification. We look at just learning about wildlife species around you and what's in your own ecosystem. We learn about the behavior and the patterns. And then we get into some of these things like, how do we move invisibly? What can I learn from tracking deer and fox and apply to my own movement that now allows me to see more wildlife when I go out there and not see them running away from me. Like, how do I actually get up and watch an animal without spooking it or even knowing I'm there? So we kind of dive into that realm. And we even finish the course up with the idea of inner tracking, which is like, okay, so now we've been doing this for 6 weeks, expanding our natural awareness. What have you learned about yourself and the way your own mind works and your own relationships work through this whole process of getting to know ecosystems in the natural world? So that's what Nature's Forgotten Language is all about. And we have a special discount code. So anyone from the WildFed community that wants to check that out, you can go to naturesforgottenlanguage.com and enter WildFed for 20% off. And I believe you'll probably have the link in the show notes there as well.
Yeah, we'll put links to all that for sure. Yep.
Sure. So that's the nature connection one. And then the other one I said, one of my other hats is in this realm of emergency preparedness. So we have a course called Survive the Storms. And this one I'm actually particularly proud of because, emergency preparedness is that thing that like everyone knows they should probably be better prepared and have all these things in place. Yet so many people don't actually ever make the time or get to doing them.
It's kind of scary because even your government, like I say your government because you guys are in Canada, I'm in the States, but both our governments are telling us to do that. When your own government's telling you, hey, you should have like a 3-day food plan and you should have like, a bug out plan. And it's kind of like, okay, if they're saying that, maybe I should be thinking about this.
Yeah. And there's three things I noticed in my kind of professional journey in emergency management. One is most people don't even have the basics in place. And that's a problem. Number two is a lot of people think they're way better prepared than they actually are. And I've done a lot of emergency disaster drills with like businesses. I've done them with governments. And it's amazing how often we'll start the drill and people are just like, oh man, we got to do this today. Like, I'm too busy. I got all these other things. Like, we know what we do. Like, I know this stuff already, or when I'm running a survival course and we do like a little mock drill in it and people are like, really? We're going to do like this skill set? Like, I know how to do this already. Why are we wasting my time? Why am I paying for this? Over and over and over again, I see people fall apart when we actually put the pressure on. So I think a lot of people are either completely ignorant and they have no idea how unprepared they are. They know they should be prepared and they never get to it, or they're overconfident, but they've never actually tested it. And when you test it, you're going to come up with all kinds of holes in your game plan.
Can I break in there for a sec? I just want to comment on that because, a lot of the training that I've done over the years has been pressure tested, usually toward the end of the workshop, So in particular around combatives and, shooting and stuff like that, sort of some stuff I do as a hobby. And, we always get pressure tested at the end. And it's so important that you pressure test what you've learned. Otherwise, you don't really know the weaknesses. But the other thing I want to say, and I just wanted to ask you about how you've seen COVID, particularly the early stages of the lockdowns. Have you seen a great humbling happen in people around this stuff? Do you think it brought and highlighted people how, because I think a lot of people, even in the preparedness scene, they had 150 years worth of freeze-dried food, but like no paper towels or toilet paper on hand. You know what I mean? And so do you think that this is exposed for the average person, maybe what some of the weaknesses are in their own systems? And then do you think even for people who are into preparedness that it's revealed missing links that they weren't aware of?
100%. I think there's been a big wake up call. And my fear is how quickly in our kind of ADD culture, people forget, and we see this scenario, even like hurricane zones, where people have a really bad hurricane, every few years. And yet they're still scrambling to buy bottled water, 2 days before the hurricane's supposed to hit land, even though they had a hurricane 2 years ago, So that's a bit of an anomaly that's kind of scary. But I do think there's been a big awakening in how vulnerable our system actually is. And I can tell you, as somebody that's actually worked with, governments and stuff, like they're not as prepared as we hope them to be. And, the other thing I think we should know that actually gives me a bit of compassion for governments is like, they can't be prepared for everything because we haven't seen everything. And these drills always expose variables. And I think that's what happened to a lot of preppers. Like these people, that said all their freeze-dried food, like for sure I was way better prepared than most people, but for sure I found holes in my game. And that's not a bad thing. That's supposed to happen. You just can't think of all of the variables. And I really thought about that in the way that I designed the Survive the Storms course. So we set it up as a mock disaster. Oh, the one other variable I just want to throw in there, I was saying, these important things that I'm witnessing is people aren't prepared because of the time factor. It's always like, oh, I know I should be prepared, but I just got all these other life priorities. So in designing Survive the Storms as a course, I'm like, okay, I want to make this fun. I want to make it interactive. I want to make it like watching Netflix, and something you're excited to do that gets you results really, really fast. And it actually stress tests what you think you already know or you don't know. So the way that we did it, again, we hired a professional film team for it, and we turned it into a 7-day course with these small little bite-sized videos. But each video is actually a mock news class about like the storm of the century that's rolling into your area. So the first day, and that's the one I said, you can try day 1 for free at survivethestorms.com. And that's the one that's all about building awareness. And then day 2, the news class comes on. It's like, okay, the storm's, only 48 hours out right now. We need to build a communications plan. To me, that's one of the low-hanging fruits that so many people don't have in place. All the wildfires that have been going on out in the West Coast, I've heard so many stories of, towns that had to get evacuated on very short notice. Husband, wife, kids, they weren't together and they had to evacuate different ways out of town. And suddenly, because of the chaos, the phones don't work, the internet doesn't work, they're separated by a physical boundary. And sometimes you could go days, and you can find all kinds of stories on the internet of people literally going days without knowing that their significant other or their kids are still alive. Like, imagine how terrifying that is. Yeah. And yet our governments have been telling us forever that we should have, like, every government website is going to say, have a family communications plan in place. But how many people actually have it? So day 2 of Survive the Storms, we basically like, okay, the storm's coming in 48 hours. Like, make your communication plan tonight. So you watch the newscast, it's all kind of dramified. And then you basically print out a workbook, and that evening you sit down with your family, and in one little bite-sized chunk, you've got it done. You've got it covered.
Nice. Yeah,
and then we walk through, day 3 is emergency kits. Day 4 is hunkering down and like learning about your home, how to teach your kids about your home, how to hunker down, how to set it up to weather a storm. Day 5 is like the aftermath, and we talk about, okay, well, if all the municipal water has been contaminated and the taps aren't running anymore, or even if they are running, the water's toxic, how do I collect water? How do I purify it? How do I store it? What do I need to know about that? Day 6 of the storm, we get into the hidden health and hygiene things that come up in a disaster. It's so sad when we hear these stories, so I saved I'm making up a fictitious one here, but you can find examples again, the dad that goes through this toxic flood water to save their child's life. And at the time, they're not thinking about all the chemicals and pollutants in there, and they save their daughter's life, but they get cancer 3 years later because of the exposure in that water, increase of insect-borne infectious diseases, increase of things like hepatitis. There's all these hidden things in the aftermath and that people just aren't aware of. And these are kind of like hidden blind things. So in day 6 of the storm, we actually talk about like identifying the hidden hazards and how you navigate around those. And then day 7 is kind of transitioning into like your longer term kind of preparedness plan for your family. So we try to make the whole thing like super fun, super to the point. So we're covering the most important topics. We're doing it in this way where it's like you sit down to watch a night of Netflix, except it's only 20 minutes. And then you have a fun challenge for the day that you carry out. And after 7 days, if you do it in 7 days, you can do it at your own pace. But after 7 days, you've got the foundations in place and you're feeling more knowledgeable, you're feeling more confident. And because we do like tests in it, we actually stress test some of the systems. We do a 20-minute challenge in there where it's like the number of people that I've talked to that are like, yeah, I've got an emergency kit. Yeah, I know where everything is. I know where my flashlight is. And it's like, okay, well, let's put the pressure on. You have to leave your house in 20 minutes. You can't come back for 2 weeks. Go. Like put the timer on and go. And every single person I've ever done that with has learned a whole lot and found some vulnerabilities in what they thought. Yeah. And, I guarantee you, I've done that test a bunch. I guarantee you, if I went home and did it tonight, I would learn something again as well, even though I've been doing this and I teach it, So that's survivethestorms.com. And the same coupon code, WildFed, will get you 20% off Survive the Storms as well.
Thank you for offering that to people. And I want to say, I just really like the way you set that up. The newscasts are really cool, man. That was a really clever idea and brings it really home. And I think just as this really great moment because it's like the confluence of so many things. I think seeing the situation in California, seeing the what's happened in some of the cities centers with some of the rioting and looting. I think seeing obviously the pandemic, all these kind of factors as they come together at the same time have really highlighted for people that kind of no matter where you live, things can happen. They're typically short term, but very intense. And like you said, having that plan, I know I keep bringing up movies here. I don't know why this is the third movie I'm going to bring up. But I'm picturing, have you ever seen the movie with Ewan McGregor called The Impossible?
I don't think I've seen that one either.
Oh, Chris, you got to watch this one, man.
Okay, I'm writing that one down.
Yeah. It's about his family. He and his family being in the tsunami in Thailand.
Oh, you know what? I have seen that one.
Man, that one's good.
So good.
You were just making me think of it when you're talking about the water situation, because I was picturing when all of the stuff that's under people's sinks and in their medicine cabinets and in their garages, all those cans of Roundup Ready and all the gasoline and all that stuff is suddenly waterborne from thousands and thousands of homes and businesses, and it's like, that's the toxic soup you're in, or like, I don't know. It's just amazing. Like kind of anywhere you are, something crazy can happen, and rather rapidly and rather unexpectedly. And looking at how quick we went into lockdown mode, for instance, or how quickly things became unavailable, it's just a real wake up call. And I think looking on the horizon right now, it's like nothing but storm clouds. Unfortunately, I'm looking forward to the time that it passes, everything does. And I think there'll be a time where we get back to some kind of sense of continuity again. But right now there's storm clouds on the horizon. So this is a really important time for people to develop that awareness. And I think what's nice about the kind of preparedness we just talked about is it's just like what we were talking about with tracking. It's just building awareness. This is a sort of like awareness about what's in your home, what's your plan, but it's all awareness stuff. And so I like how all your work kind of wraps back around to that topic of coming to your senses and being aware.
Yeah, it's definitely foundational.
Man, this has been a really, really fun conversation. Thanks so much for your time today.
Yeah, it's been great to be here, Daniel. I've really enjoyed this, and I've just loved watching or listening to the show over the years too.
Thank you. Tell people one more time where they find you on the web, on social media, and again, where they can find those courses and what that coupon code is.
Great. Yeah. So the two courses, www.naturesforgottenlanguage.com, or in the show notes if that's too long to remember, and then www.survivethestorms with an S on the end of it, survivethestorms.com. WildFed gets you 20% off either of those. And then if you want to just kind of check out what I'm doing in the world, I've actually been in the process of getting off all social media.
Yeah, man.
So I'm getting off Instagram. I'm getting off Facebook. I've had enough of it. So I'm going to be focusing on my newsletters a lot the next little bit, and just like more real relationships, webcasts, podcasts. I'm just kind of done. And I'm not dishing social media to each their own, but it's just not for me. So don't go looking for me on Instagram. Don't go looking for me on Facebook, but you can check out my two websites. So www.changingworldproject.com is my blog around
Changing World Project.
Yeah, Changing World Project. That's the blog around emergency disaster preparedness and kind of this holistic approach. I also have chrisoutdoors.ca. I'm Canadian, but you should be able to access it from the States. chrisoutdoors.ca. That's kind of my work in the outdoors. And then I also have the wild food business. So anyone that wants to kind of check out what we're doing around harvesting sustainably from the land and turning it into like gourmet products, cocktail bitters, you can check out wildmuskoka.com as well for that one.
Spell that for folks.
Oh, yeah. You guys, Muskoka is a region. It's the area that I live in. I forget that not everyone's going to know that. So wild, W-I-L-D, Muskoka is M-U-S-K-O-K-A. M-U-S-K-O-K-A, wildmuskoka.com. And that's the wild foods business.
Cool, man. We're going to put links to all that. I guess, I was about to wrap it up, and now I just want to ask you a little bit more about this social media piece. I'm playing around. I've been looking at, have you ever seen this thing called the Light Phone?
No.
Yeah, it's like a phone.
I want to know.
It's a phone that's come out that's designed to be used as little as possible. So it's like an e-ink reader instead of a blue light screen, the old Kindles were, where you just sort of looks like you're looking at newsprint. And it does calls, it does text, but it doesn't do photos. It doesn't do emojis. It doesn't host apps. It's got an alarm on it. They're working on a calendar feature, but I mean, it's basically designed for you not to be using it. And so right now I'm like weighing back and forth, like, can I realistically do that with what my work is and my businesses are? How much can I pull back? And not because I don't want to communicate with my audience or with my friends or with my loved ones, because I certainly do, but because the toxicity of social media and the constant distraction in our environment is really starting to accumulate. So yeah, I just wondering if you want to say anything more about your desire to get off social media and how it intertwines with all the things we've been talking about, like awareness of your environment and like the ability to tune into your senses. Yeah.
I love that. So, I mean, there's a lot there. We could do a whole podcast episode on that one, but I'll break down the essence of it is, this whole podcast has been about awareness. And I think the potential of human awareness is so far beyond what most people even realize is possible. And certainly for myself in my 20s, I identified as a fairly intelligent, aware, connected person. And when I look back at myself now, I'm like, I was a fool back then, and I was oblivious to like 99.9% of what's going on around me. And I really, in the height of all of my tracking naturalist survival training, was feeling so on the ball. Although, who knows, I'm curious 20 years down the road if I'm going to look back and think that I'm a fool now too.
Probably.
I can almost guarantee it. But the point being, since I resisted getting a phone for so long, I felt my brain change.
Yes,
and they're designed to do that, and I actually have to fight for my awareness. It's harder for me to sit down and read a book now. And I do it, and I make myself do it, but I actually struggle with it. I feel the same draw everyone else does to like pull up and look at the information on my phone, check the news, check social media. There's so much useful information around me. I think even more useful information around me right now in the natural environment that I'm missing because I'm looking for information on my phone. And we start to create these patterns that we need all that information from our phone. But I would make the argument that we probably need the information from our local environment more than we need the information from our phone. Mm-hmm. And for me, I'm just in choosing that that's kind of what's more important to me, that local information. It's funny, I've got, this could open up a huge rabbit hole, but I'm going to try and say this in a way that it doesn't. I think there's a good reason why conspiracy theories are running rampant right now. There's a lot of reasons why people question things. And at the end of the day, there's going to be conspiracies that are actually true. But I know so many people that are so caught up in these ridiculous conspiracy theories because everything's theoretical based on information on their phone. And that if they actually talked to real people and observed real things, it proves their conspiracy wrong beyond 100% doubt. Like the facts are right in front of them in the real world, but they're reading all the stuff on their phone and not even seeing the real evidence in front of them.
Wait, but the earth is flat, right? Like we agree on that.
There we go, right? So it's like, in this digital world, we can create this alternate reality and think it's truth, but the truth isn't there. It goes back to that original quote you said, navigating the fog of chaos requires a compass that is true. That's why WildFed is about more than just a meal. And that's really why I'm getting off of my phone and getting off of social media is I want the truth in this world. And I think that I'm a more efficient human being, and I'm going to react better to some of the challenges if I'm completely hyper tuned in to my own senses and the physical world when those challenges come up is more valuable than being tuned into all the stories and gossips and distractions that are out there. Being a business owner, there's a little bit of a fear that comes around backing off of these things. But at the end of the day, I find that actually, the majority of my business, my clients, my relationships are come from real relationships that I've built, getting to know people, shaking hands with people, having those conversations and those are the relationships that I appreciate more in life, or the jobs and the contracts that come through are usually the ones that are more meaningful and come through relationship anyways. So I'm going to go back to, how I believe humans have been for most of history and make my business model relationship based instead of kind of clickbait based or like stimulus based on social media. It's a bit of an experiment. I'll see how it works. But, as I call it an experiment, that's how things work for, 200,000 years of human history. And it's an incredible short blip, blink of the eye that suddenly we think we need a phone to survive in the world or to run a business. And I actually don't think that's true. And I'm looking to make some shifts. And I'll have some interface with technology, obviously. I'm still going to have a website. I'm still going to have a blog. I'm going to do webinars. I'm going to do podcasts. But I really want to get away from the things that I actually feel repatterning my brain and that are actually making me weaker as an individual physically and in my awareness and even in my mind and my ability to process information, which to me is social media and this constant need to get information quickly. I think it's so much more rewarding to have to work from it and to track the physical signs to come to conclusions. And I suspect those conclusions are actually going to be way more accurate than they are when we're piecing together little bits of stories on the internet.
It's weird how what I find in myself is this tendency to think, because I love to read books. And for a little while there, I hadn't been reading books very much. I mean, I'm a voracious reader, but I'd be reading on my phone all the time. And then I started to notice this tendency where I would feel like, well, whatever's in those books is already in those books, but what's happening in media is happening right now. So I need it because it's fresh. as opposed to this old information in the book. That's a dangerous thing. That's like chasing the dragon. That's a big part of it. The movie The Social Dilemma, there's movie number, I think that's my fourth, or was that my fifth reference? For people who haven't seen it, that's pretty hard hitting documentary out right now on Netflix, which I really, really recommend. Ultimately, it's like when you start to notice that the tool, you are no longer using the tool is using you, like you've become the tool, and the machine is using you. And needs you, like, because what we could also say, sort of based on what you had just your comments a moment ago, it's like you can exist without the machine, but the machine can't exist without you, right? So like true. It needs your body. It's a bit like we're talking about a demon that's disembodied in a way, where it's like the demon needs your body, but your body you have your own consciousness in your body. Like you don't need the demon, but the demon needs you, And so we're getting to this really creepy point here where it's like these things need bodies, and these things to learn, the machine learning, like it needs our cognition to learn. And I just want to say, so now I'll go book reference. I'm a huge fan of the writer, obviously now deceased, but Frank Herbert, who wrote the Dune series. And interestingly, this year, movie number 6. Wow, this is weird. This doesn't usually happen. But Denis Villeneuve's version of Dune's coming out this year. In the book series, cool. Yeah, I know, very incredible writer. And in his science fiction, the universe is populated by humans, no aliens or anything, just humans throughout the universe. But they had long ago had this jihad where they had destroyed all the thinking machines. And there's a prohibition throughout the universe against building machines in the image of the human mind, because it had already been done, and it was so dangerous and toxic and destructive that they destroyed all the thinking machines. I used to think that he had done that because it would be too hard in his day to predict what future technologies would be like. And so it was almost like a safeguard against, because now you watch like old sci-fi and everything is like 70s technology in the future, So I thought he was getting around that. But actually now I realize what a great premonition he had, that these machines would actually start to hijack our own consciousness. And so it's a really powerful kind of bit of fiction, because now I'm seeing how many voices there are of people who are starting to say, hey, I need to get away from this stuff. Like a lot of the best minds are starting to distance themselves from social media and from their phones. So, hearing you say that's just more corroborative evidence for me, because I know I can run Instagram on my computer. I don't need to run it on my phone. I don't need it in my pocket constantly grabbing at me, like it's taking away from my quality of life. And it's funny because the whole Instagram thing is like, check out my quality of life. Right. And so it's funny trying to share that with people when you're actually undermining it. So anyway, I'll be, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, you're saying the machines need us. I'll say that nature needs us right now really badly too. Nature needs people that actually understand how the intricacies of ecosystems work.
Right.
And our families and our future generations need us to actually be aware, alert people to navigate some of the challenging times ahead. So
yeah. And the difference is nature doesn't want to take anything away from you. Nature wants to nourish and feed you, but the technology wants to take something from you, and it doesn't give a lot back. It looks like it does on the surface, and you soon realize it doesn't. So anyway, man, I'll be out here supporting you from afar, because I'll be doing similar things, and be interesting to have you on again in the future and talk more about this stuff, and also see where we're at in the sort of unplugging, the great unplugging of 2021.
Awesome. Great conversation, Daniel. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. You can help us grow the show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh, new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out the WildFed video show and store. WildFed. Food is all around you.